Great, thanks. So my name is Gary Matzel. I'm a senior sales consultant with Oracle in our WebCenter product division. Today we're going to be talking about one of the products that I'm responsible for, WebCenter Imaging. And we're going to be focusing on WebCenter Imaging for Oracle eBusiness Suite Financials. What we're going to be talking about is the imaging solution for accounts payable. And as we go through, we'll be focusing mainly on that accounts payable business case, but you'll see that the WebCenter Imaging solution can actually be applied across the board for any paper-based processes that you might have in your organization. So as we're talking about the different pieces that go into the solution, I'll emphasize different areas where you can use that same piece of technology for multiple business applications. So when we look at the problem in most payables organizations, and really when you look at any paper-based process, the problem with that process is typically the paper. The problem stems mainly from the high volumes and the different types of formats that you're dealing with of that paper. In accounts payable invoices, you're dealing with multiple vendors. Typically, you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of vendors, and each of those vendors is going to have a different invoice format, and you're typically getting hundreds or thousands of invoices a day or week, so that the volumes of that paper and the variety of that paper causes a lot of issues in terms of how it's processed. The process of that paper can be inefficient, and it's inefficient not just to process the paper, but also to store the paper. You're having to deal with the cost of buying the paper, of moving the paper around in the organization, and then finally having to store that information, whether it's on-site or off-site. Once it's been processed and you need to find it later on, it's difficult to search for that information. You have to go digging through boxes or digging through file cabinets to get at that information that you had already processed. And then once it is stored, you're facing different issues for retaining that information and making sure that you're getting rid of that information in a timely manner. As you keep more and more of that information around, it starts to become higher and higher risk for your organization. Anytime you have that paper around and anytime it's involved in any type of legal matter, you need to be able to reproduce that paper, and if you don't, there are penalties to be paid. So in any paper-based process, the paper is typically the problem because of the volumes, because of the need to move it around and find it and retain it. In an accounts payable department, that typically manifests itself in an overall delay in the processing of that invoice. So from the opening of all of that mail, entering in the invoice manually, validating the information against what you have in your eBusiness Suite system, against the PO information, routing it around for the different approvals that you have, and then once it's finally returned to accounts payable and paid, you may be looking at more than 30 days to process that. Now, that may be in the exception cases, and you may have a very good process for handling that paper on a regular basis when everything is fine, but as soon as something goes wrong with that, as soon as you need to send it out to people, as soon as you need to move it out of the regular path, that's when you're going to start to face some of these delays. And you're going to be looking for that information. You may lose some of that information. You may lose visibility of that information so that you don't know where it is in the process and you don't have control over being able to bring that back into the regular flow. So we're seeing in the industry, in some of the different studies that we've done and looked at, we're looking at a manual processing cost per invoice of about $20. Now again, the problem with paper is volume. In those volumes of invoices that you're dealing with, if you can reduce that cost by just a small amount, then you're going to realize some very large savings because of that volume. And really that's what we're trying to do with our solution. We're trying to reduce the cost of processing each of those invoices. And the way that we do that is in a couple of different steps. The first one is to capture that paper, get it out of the process as quickly as possible. So if you are getting paper invoices into your organization, into the mailroom, scan them at that point, digitize them, and then move that digital image through the process rather than moving the paper through the process. Once you've captured that image, then you can store it in a central repository where it's easy to retrieve, it's easy to manage and workflow, and it's also easy to retain and secure, so you've got better control over that electronic form of that invoice. And then you can incorporate some of the basic workflow that we have to accelerate the process, to move it around through its regular process if it's a good invoice, but also through the exception processes if there's something wrong with the invoice. And once the person's done processing it, get it back into the flow as quickly as possible. So we're looking at lowering the processing and storage costs because we're eliminating the paper out of this scenario. We're reducing the cycle times because we're moving it around with automated workflow and getting people notified and getting the information back in the flow as quickly as possible. That gives you a couple of things. It gives you better visibility into the process, so you know exactly where things are throughout that cycle. And knowing where things are gives you better control over your financials, gives you better visibility into what's in the process, how much you have for any given time period, and gives you better control over the process in general, so that if you see that there are any bottlenecks, if you see that there are any problems with the process, you can make corrections to that flow. And what we've seen is, by doing this with our solution, that the average cost of processing an invoice drops from $20 down to $12. And again, when you're dealing with large volumes, that amount of savings makes a big difference. You can see from some of our customers that they've actually achieved very good return on investment and actually reduced the cost very significantly of processing their invoices. Embry-Riddle, for example, achieved 180% ROI, and in a very short time period as well. So in 6 months, they've actually realized the cost of a system like this. When we're dealing with high volume invoicing, for example, with Home Depot and Costco, you can see that for Costco, for example, reducing the cycle time from days down to seconds is saving them millions of dollars. In Home Depot, they actually had to increase their AP staff every time that they opened a new store, so they had to hire new people to be able to handle the workload of the invoicing for that store. So once they implemented this system, they were actually able to maintain that same level of AP staff while still increasing the number of invoices that amount of staff was able to process. So they were able to open new stores and not requiring new accounts payable staff to cover that extra workload. So what we're going to be looking at in this flow is basically what we talked about earlier, being able to scan that invoice as soon as it comes in. If there are any problems with the scan, then you can deal with it right at that point. You can also pass it to the next step, which will extract information from that scanned image. And the extraction, again, if there are any issues with that, you'll have the ability to have somebody involved and correct those invoices. But you'll see as we go through this process, there are very few touch points required if it's a clean invoice, and even if there's something wrong with it, there are, again, very small touch points where human intervention is required. So once we've extracted it, we'll store it in our repository. We'll validate the information and try and post it against the eBusiness Suite. Again, if there's any problems with the invoice creation in eBusiness Suite, then we can route it through the exception workflow, and then it's going to go through the regular processing and payment through eBusiness Suite. Now, the way that we do that is, again, with different pieces of the solution. When we're looking at the solution, the first part is the capture, which allows you not only to scan paper invoices, but import invoices from different forms or different sources, and we'll see that in a second. The next stage, the extraction and indexing of information, allows you to pull information intelligently off that scanned image. And then again, we'll focus in more detail on that in a couple of seconds as we drill down into these components. Once we've extracted that information, we'll use the information that we've extracted to index and store that image in a central repository where now it's searchable, it's secure, and it's accessible from multiple touch points, whether it's our standard browser interface or it's accessed through the ERP system, in this case, eBusiness Suite. And we'll see access through the eBusiness Suite screens in our integration with eBusiness Suite. And then finally, if there are any issues with that, then we can route it through the workflow to resolve those exceptions. And then underlying all of this is a monitoring capability where you'll have visibility into the process and be able to see what's going on, get reports back on what's in that process and then be able to make corrections if necessary. So in the capture piece, we're looking at taking that paper form of the invoice and turning it into an electronic form. So we've got a couple of versions of this software. One is mainly to run in a corporate mailroom where you've got a central operation. All of your information flows into that single location. So you're going to be taking that invoice in the mailroom, opening it up, sorting them, scanning them, and right from there, moving it on into the next step in the process, which could be the extraction, or it could be storing that information into the repository directly. We also have a distributed version of this where from a regional office where the volumes are lower, or you may be getting the invoices directly to the people who ordered the goods, they can do the scanning of that directly from their desktop, open up a browser to our browser application, scan in the paper, and have it go into the same process without having to package it up, mail it into the central location. So this solution actually supports multiple types of scanners, the high volume enterprise scanners that you might have in your mailroom, individual desktop scanners, or if you're scanning something other than invoices like expense receipts or contracts, it also supports multifunction devices where the information can be dropped directly into a folder. We'll monitor that folder and pull in that information automatically. And again, if you're pulling in information from other sources other than scanning paper, for example, if your vendors are emailing you invoices as attachments, or people are emailing you information or faxing you information, we can directly pull that information from those sources into the process, just as if you would scan the paper yourself. So the next step really is one of the keys to the value of a solution like this. It's going to eliminate a lot of the manual data entry and a lot of the errors that might go along with that manual entry. What we do is we extract information automatically from the invoice format, and the way that we do that is without having to create any templates. So back in the early days of OCR, or optical character recognition, when you wanted to pull information off of an invoice form like this or any other type of form, you had to tell the system exactly where to find that piece of information, and you had to do that for all of the different forms and form types that you were dealing with. Now, if you wanted to do that for invoices, you'd have to do that for every form that your vendors are sending you. And if you're dealing with thousands of vendors, you're also dealing with thousands of different invoice formats. So the ability to pull off that information without having to set up a template is key. So what we've done is we do intelligent document recognition of that information to pull off those key values without having to tell the system where those values are on the invoice. We train it, and we've gone through that training process so that it knows how to find that information on a page without having to exactly locate it. Now, since we've gone through the training, we can actually, you can go in and start to scan invoices day one for vendor formats that this system has never seen before. So we've gone through the process of doing that training, and you can go and do additional training if you want for other vendor invoice formats that it might not recognize, or other types of documents that you might be scanning in. So if you're using this for HR and you want to scan in HR forms, then you can use the system to train and find the information on those forms and use that to index the information, index the image in our repository. Now back to invoices, when we trained it to pull off not just the header information, so the vendor name, the vendor address, invoice number, date, PO number, and information like that. We've also taught it to extract line item detail. So it's going to extract that information. It's also going to validate that information with an external data source. In this case, it could be your ERP data. So in eBusiness Suite or EBS, it's going to look for your vendor information. It's going to look for the name and the address in your vendor master. If it finds it, then it can use that to come back with a vendor ID or a site ID. And if it doesn't, then it can flag that invoice as requiring some type of exception processing. In this case, it might just be that it needs to have that vendor entered, so it's going to route it to vendor maintenance. It can also take the information that it's read for the PO, so the PO number, look up that information in your PO database and match the information or pair the information in the line items for that invoice to the line items that are on the PO. And it does some fuzzy searching or fuzzy logic to pair up that information. So it's not strictly looking for an exact match on the description, on the quantities, on the unit price. It uses a combination of all that information to be able to pair the information from the invoice to the purchase order. So the key here is eliminating a lot of the human intervention in invoice processing. If everything reads through cleanly, and we've seen an 80% reliability rate on the information that we extract, then the process can go through without anybody having to touch that invoice unless there's a problem with it. So once it's been scanned, that information has been extracted, we'll store that image in our repository with that information as index values or searchable fields for that information. But we'll also take that information and push it into eBusiness Suite as an invoice. So we'll try to create the invoice. If we can do it, great. We've got the invoice information in the system. We've attached the image to that invoice. If not, we'll still try to create the invoice. We'll dummy up some of the information that didn't work when we tried to create it the first time to eliminate as much of the data entry as we can. We'll flag that one as an exception, put it on additional holds that need to be validated, but it's still in the system. Now, to access that information, what we've done is connect our imaging repository to eBusiness Suite through one of the standard integration points, the Zoom menu. That gives us a very small footprint inside of EBS so that when you go to upgrade your EBS system or upgrade your imaging system, it's not going to break that connection. And you can configure the values that are on the Zoom menu based on who the person is or what screen you're looking at to give them different options for processing images. So we're going to start processing the invoice. That gives us access to the task list for me to process, gives me access to different work queues, whether it's a standard processing queue or an exception queue. And then I'm looking at the image of the invoice with the available task actions where I can reroute that if necessary. I can just complete the invoice if everything's fine. I can request additional information if I need to, or route it through one of the exception workflows for supplier maintenance or some type of specialist review. There's also annotation tools that are available in this viewer, so if I need to mark up that image, I can do that, but I'm not changing the original image. I'm just laying those annotations on top of the original image, and I can always reproduce that original if I need to. Once it's in the workflow, once it's in the system, it's going to get picked up by the workflow and get routed around for either validation, so everything went through cleanly, or through some type of exception handling if there was some problem with it. That's when the people need to get involved. There needs to be a human touch point. Anybody that needs to get involved will get an email notification. In there will be a link that you can click on that'll bring them right to their task list. They can view the items or tasks in that list, see the image that we just saw, and be able to process it quickly without having to jump back and forth between applications, jump to email to attach new documentation. All of that's going to get handled by the system. In the workflow, you can build in and configure business rules to handle the information, handle the images in different ways based on things like dollar value or by vendor or by business unit that the invoice has been delivered to. There's also delegation and escalation that you can build in based on, again, business rules that you develop for the invoice processing. And then finally, there's an underlying monitoring capability that lets you see all the information for the invoices that are in flight. So once it's been scanned into the system, once we've extracted that information, it starts to get pushed into the workflow, and we can build up these dashboards very easily to see dollar amounts, vendor information, time frames, even exceptions, so you can see, have alerts on whether or not a certain exception level is getting too big, whether a certain vendor, for example, is sending you too many duplicate invoices. And you can configure this dashboard. And again, we're using standard Oracle technology here. The workflow is standard workflow, standard Oracle workflow. This is Oracle's business activity monitoring tool, which again is standards-based reporting on items in the workflow. So we have customers who are using this not just for accounts payable, and there's really no reason why it has to be for just accounts payable. It can be for other paper-based processes, like I said at the beginning. So for things like procure to pay or order to cash, or travel and expenses is one of the big ones. HR onboarding and benefits is another big one. So those two are probably tied for second as the next big application that's using this type of system. But it will follow the same types of process where you can capture, extract, store that, and access it from browser interface or from the application screens. When you use it for multiple applications or multiple business processes like this, you get a faster payback on a type of system like this. The licensing doesn't change. You can use this for as many different business processes as you like. We don't charge additional fees for modules. We don't charge for additional users. It's CPU-based licensing. So you get better efficiencies. You're storing everything in one repository. You're not having to maintain multiple repositories. So finally, why Oracle WebCenter Imaging? Why are we looking at a solution like this? And the key here is more imaging, more automation to reduce the cost and the complexity of your process. It's a complete solution, first of all. It's an end-to-end Oracle solution, all the way from the capture through the access and store and extract, all the way into the ERP system. So it's all Oracle developed, Oracle supported, Oracle integrated. And we provide you with the level of comfort that this system will work and all the pieces will work together. So you can use this as an enterprise system, enterprise imaging system and automation for anything beyond AP, including AP. But it's an enterprise-grade content management system underlying all of this. So you get all of the standard document management, all of the standard version control, all of the standard security, but then above and beyond that, you get things like records management and retention management of the information that's in that repository. It's an integrated solution. So like I said before, it's an end-to-end Oracle solution. It's all been integrated. The integrations that we provide are standards-based, but also productized. So it's not something that we have to rebuild every time we come into a different customer. It's there, it's configurable, and we set it up for not only eBusiness Suite, but for PeopleSoft and for JD Edwards. And this is a strategic solution. It's, like I said, an enterprise-grade content management system. It's based on Oracle standards for workflow, for business activity monitoring, for integration, and it gives you a better enterprise-wide automation for all the processes. And going forward, it's going to be and is the standard for unstructured content storage in Fusion applications. So if there are no questions, we'll jump into the demo. Let me just get out of the PowerPoint here. So I'm going to switch over to my demo system, and we're going to go through the process. What I've done is reproduce that process slide here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through capture. We're going to see the extraction and the indexing. We'll see how the information is stored in the repository. We will be able to access that from eBusiness Suite, and we'll see how the workflow or the people involved in the workflow will interact with that part of the process. So the first stage is the capture. So in the mailroom from the user's desktop, you'll be able to scan documents into the system, either add index information manually, which we won't be seeing in this demo, or send it to the automatic index extraction with our intelligent document recognition. So the first stage is to scan. And you can have multiple scanning profiles set up for different types of scanners that you might be using or for different types of documents that you might be scanning into this. So I'm going to be scanning invoices. I'm going to send it to our forms recognition solution. So I go ahead and I click on the scan icon, and this one's configured to look for those files in a directory. Now you can have this set up so that if you've got your scanner hooked up, I don't have one hooked up right now, it'll just start feeding the paper in. Or in this case, it might be that you have people scanning in information on a multifunction device and it drops it into this folder, or I can manually pull it in, or you can set up the system to automatically pull it in from that folder. So as I go through this process, you'll see there's a lot of touch points that I'm doing in this process that you may or may not want to do. For example, if I want to go in here and look at that batch of documents that I just scanned to make sure that I've got good quality images, I can do that. That capability is here in the tool. But if you want to have a completely touchless process, this may not be something that you want to do. You might want to just pass it through onto the next step and not see those images again until there was a problem with them. So here in the quality assurance, I can do a couple of different things. If I've read it in a large batch with multi-page invoices and I need to reorder those, I can just drag and drop and reorder those images. If it got scanned in incorrectly, it got scanned in upside down, for example, I can flip the image, I can rotate the image. If I've got a bad image in here, the paper got crinkled up in the scanner, I can eliminate that from the batch and then rescan it in. So I can scan to replace or scan to insert in the middle of the batch or at the end of the batch. But basically all I'm doing here is making sure that all the documents I need are in the batch, they're all good quality images, and I can pass it on to the next step. Now, if I'm scanning in for something like a human resources application, I'm scanning in benefits forms or I'm scanning in onboarding documents, I might want to go through an additional step here where I add index information manually. So basically I'm looking at the image, I'm typing in information for that image, and then it goes directly into the repository. But in this use case, what I'm going to do is just scan in the invoices, make sure that I've got a good batch, and then once I'm done, I'm going to close that window, and it's going to ask me if I want to commit the batch. What that's going to do is pass it on to the next step. In this case, it's going to pass it on to the intelligent document recognition. If I did manual indexing, it could pass it directly and store it in our imaging repository, where now it's accessible from our browser interface as also from the application interface. So I've committed that batch, it's out of document capture, and I've gone through the capture process complete. So having done that, I don't need to go through this again. I could scan in more batches as they come in and get those into the process as well. So I've gone through the scanning, the capture. We didn't emphasize a lot of the other capabilities where you can import images directly from email, so we can monitor email inboxes. Any of the attachments that come in on those emails, we can strip off and add them as a batch, just like I did for scanning. We can also monitor fax servers, and we can monitor folders, like I mentioned. So now we're going to go to the extraction stage. Now in the extraction stage, a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. So as I scanned in that batch, it imported it into the document recognition. And again, this is something that's going on continually throughout the day. I don't need to come into this tool and monitor this. I'm just going to show you the steps that it went through. So I imported the documents. I went and OCR'd the document, so I pulled off all the readable text from that document. And then I classified it. Was it an invoice? Was it a credit memo? Was it an HR form? Once I determine what type of document it is, then I know what information to extract from that document. So it extracted all that information. If it extracted everything cleanly, then it would have exported that information to the next step, which is import into the repository and import into eBusiness Suite. We've intentionally put in some errors in those invoices so that it would stop at the verification stage. So we're going to go look at that batch of documents in that step. So in the verification, again, if there's any exceptions, any problems with this, that's when a human needs to get involved. So that person would come into this verifier tool, look at the batch of documents that are coming in, and be able to review the information that was extracted and compare that to what's on the invoice. Now, it's going to take you directly to the errors in the batch. It's as soon as it finds that first problem in the batch, it's going to take you to that. In this case, it was on the first page. But if it was on page 50, I wouldn't see the first 49 invoices. But on this invoice, you can see it did pull off a lot of the information correctly. It got the invoice number, and you can see it's highlighted over here. You can see down below what it read off the invoice itself, and then what it interpreted that information, the date, the PO number it read the dollar amounts for the subtotals, for the tax, and the total amount. It also read the line item detail. So it pulled off, I'd say, 95 or 98% of this information correctly, and it actually read the vendor information correctly. The problem was that it couldn't find a vendor with that information in my external data reference, in this case, my vendor master. So it's flagging this as the closest match that it could find, but it didn't reliably get that piece of information, so it's asking me to confirm that. So I can go in and I can do a vendor search, and it can come back with the top 5 or the top 10 matches that are close to what it found. Or I could type it in manually, or in this case, I can say, I'm just going to zero that out, and I'm going to flag this as missing vendor or missing vendor site. Now we can move on to the other ones, and we can see that it pulled off this one cleanly, so all the information is in green. It got all the dollar amounts, got the PO number, got the invoice information. And if it has a PO number, it's going to classify this as a PO invoice. If it doesn't find one, like in this case, it's going to classify it as a non-PO. And those two different types of invoices are going to be routed differently in the system. So we can determine right off the bat whether or not there needs to be different processing. For a non-PO, for example, we're going to see that it's going to go through a coding and approving workflow. So somebody out in the field is going to get a notification that they have an invoice to approve. They can come in through our coding form, add the GL coding to it, and then move it along in the workflow. So in this batch of 4 documents, we had this one that had the problem. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that because I didn't save it before. And then once I'm done that, I just hit enter. And once I've made all my corrections, it's going to ask me if I want to release this batch. So I say yes. And it takes all the index information, all of that information in that form, and uses that to store the document in the imaging repository. And it's going to use that information to create those invoices in EBS. Now that form that you saw on the left-hand side there, that's completely configurable. If you want to add more information to that, you can. If you want to create a new form, you can do that. If you're doing it for a different type of application like an HR onboarding or a contract or something like that, then you can build whatever form you need, whatever document type you need, and teach the system to recognize the information on that. Built into that verification, too, is the ability to teach the system on documents that it should already know. So if there was an error on your invoice that is recurring, you might want to teach it to recognize that information more reliably. So you can go through additional teaching very easily and enhance the system that way. So now that we've gone through the scanning and extraction, we're going to look at how the information is stored and how I can access that information from the ERP system. So I'm going to open up my eBusiness Suite and log in as a WebCenter user. Now I'm going to be the AP person now. I'm logging into the invoice entry screen. So I'm a typical EBS user. I go in, I do entry of invoices all day long. So here's my invoice entry screen. And like I said before, underneath the Zoom menu, we've got the ability, and we see that the configuration is slightly different here. I can process invoices, attach additional information, or access documents in the repository using what we call managed attachments. So I'm just going to process the invoices, and what that's going to do is give me access to my work lists, to my work queues. So I can go in through my email and access that, or right from the application I can come in here and access that same list of information. Now I'm logging into multiple applications here, but if you're using something like a single sign-on, the user would just transition from one application to the other, and they wouldn't need to log in multiple times. So this person has access to multiple queues. So the profile up here, you'll see I've got access to validation queues, to manual entry queues, high priority, specialist exception. And again, you can configure this so that based on the role of the user who's accessing this, you've got access to different work queues. So we can go through, and for all the ones that came in cleanly, we can just we can look at the verification and verify that information in eBusiness Suite. So as I click on that View Task link, it's going to open up the image in the viewer. It's going to show me the options that I have to route this, and it's going to also show me some of the information that it pulled off of that invoice, for invoice number, for supplier information, scan date information, and so forth. And you can see down below, it's actually matched up some of the lines on the invoice to PO information that it found, and actually extracted some of the GL account information and assigned that to the lines on the invoice. So we've looked at this document. We can take this invoice number that we see here, and we can just go look that up in my Oracle Invoice workbench, do a quick lookup, find that invoice, and you'll see a couple of things when it comes back. You'll see this invoice was created completely from that information. It's got the PO number, it's got the supplier number, it's got the invoice number, invoice date. You can see the line items that it extracted from the invoice have been paired up and with the PO number and the PO line item number. And you can see that by default we put it on a verification hold. So as we put it into the system, it's not going to get paid automatically. It's going to be on this verification hold until somebody can come in and release that hold. Now that's our out-of-the-box workflow that we send with the product. You can create this so that it goes right in and gets paid, or it gets put on additional holds if you need it to. So I've verified the information. I've seen that everything's okay on this. One of the other things that we'll see as we look at the invoice in eBusiness Suite is that the invoice image has been attached. Now it's not attached and stored in eBusiness Suite. It's stored in our imaging repository, and we're just creating a link to that document. So if I'm solely an eBusiness Suite user and that's the only way that I look for invoices, I still have access to the invoice image. I can just go to the paperclip and look up that invoice image and see that document right from that interface. Again, I don't have to jump to multiple interfaces. I don't have to have multiple applications open. So I've looked in eBusiness Suite. Everything looks fine. I'm going to go back to my work list screen and say, okay, that's great. Everything looks fine. I'm going to complete this invoice. So with our integration between the workflow and eBusiness Suite, we've actually done a couple of different things. We've made it possible to pass information back and forth between eBusiness Suite and the imaging repository. So for workflow, like I just did here, I've changed that information, so I'm just going to update it by searching for it again. And now when we go to the holds, having completed it in the workflow has released the hold here in eBusiness Suite, so now it's going to get paid. So we can update information back and forth. I've updated the hold information here in eBusiness Suite. If this was a manual entry, if I keyed the information for that invoice in the eBusiness Suite as I was looking at it in imaging, the information that I typed in here would be updated on the image in our imaging repository. So I come back here, and now it's time to process some of the failures. So these things need to have additional work done for them. So I'm just going to pick one of these tasks and see what the problem was with this one. So I look at the invoice, I look at the validation holds, and I can see that this one has an invalid PO number. So again, I can go into eBusiness Suite, I can verify that information, I can look that up, make sure that it is an invalid PO number, look into the PO system, and look for that information. But once I've determined that there needs to have additional work done on this, I can reroute it quickly just by clicking on one of these task actions. So in this case, I'm going to click on the specialist exception. I'm going to say that this is an invalid PO, but you can set up different exception codes for this, and then click OK. And now I've moved that task on to the person who needs to work on it. So this has gone to an AP specialist. They can do some work on it, make corrections to it, either determine that it needs to get sent back to the vendor, or if everything's been corrected, it can come back to me, and now I can do entry or validation of that information. Now we can also come in here and look at this one. We can see this one has also an invalid PO, but this was the one where we couldn't find the supplier. So again, we can look at the validation holds here. We can look at the information that's in the eBusiness Suite just by searching for that invoice. I'm going to take that invoice number and come look for it here. Oops. So on this one, you'll see that it's got those additional holds in here as well. So it's got that invalid PO number and the no supplier, and you'll also see that it's dummied up the vendor that it has in the trading partner supplier number. So it's used a dummy vendor that we've created, but it's managed to get most of the information in for that invoice into the system. So again, we've eliminated a lot of the data entry. This needs to be validated, a vendor needs to be put in here, but it might need to go through vendor maintenance first. So I can come back here and route it through supplier maintenance, say that it's an invalid vendor or invalid site, and now it's going to go to the person who does supplier maintenance. As soon as they're done with it, they can complete their task and it will come back into my queue. So the person who is working with that task outside of EBS can either work through their email, so the supplier maintenance queue, or they might have shortcuts on their desktop like this where they can just come in. And you can see there's that invoice that got routed for supplier maintenance. So they might be in this constantly. They can come in here, view the task, do the entry of that vendor in the vendor maintenance, and then say complete that, and it'll go back to the accounts payable queue. Now, one of the other workflows that we have is the non-PL or non-PO GL coding workflow. So that invoice that came in that didn't have a PO number on it is going through this workflow here. So somebody's got to review that, do the coding on it, approve it, and send it back to AP. So rather than create the invoice first and route it out to this person, what we've done is create this workflow where it's going to route it out to this person. They can review it, again, do the coding that they need to do. They can open up the invoice, see the invoice as they're doing the coding on it so they can see all the information necessary to do the coding, open it up, pick one of the line items that they want to edit, enter in the GL coding information either as an alias, or they can type in all the company department account coding separately, and they can add project information if that's something that you're doing. So I pick that line, I update the GL coding information, pick my next line, go in and edit that information. Now the GL codes that we're looking at here are actually being pulled directly out of eBusiness Suite, so these are valid codes. We can filter that list if it's by business unit that you want to have available, then we can do that as well. So we're looking at this. We've done all the coding that we need to. I can approve this. I can reassign it. So if it needs to go through additional routing from this point, I can do that from here. But in this case, I'm just going to approve that, and it's going to go on to the next step. So now that I've done that approving, done that coding, it's actually going to get the invoice created in eBusiness Suite with that coding information. So we've gone through, we've captured, we've extracted, we've stored it in the invoice, we've accessed it from the ERP system, and we've seen some of the routing that's going on behind the scenes. Now from an access point, we can also come into the system and look at that just from the browser interface. So I'm going to close down my application screens. And go in and look at the invoices through our browser interface. So this, for non-EBS users who need to have access to the images, for people who are just doing auditing of this information or just looking for a specific invoice, they can come in here without having to go into EBS and find those invoices. So depending on who the user is, you can have different searches configured for them to search by different values. This one we've got that's pretty rudimentary. You can just look by organization ID, by transaction ID, but you can also set up searches for looking at the invoices by vendor, or looking at it by date range, looking at it by dollar value, whatever. Once they type in that information, you can set up what information gets returned in these search results. So I'm looking at the scan date, the status, so I can see where it is in the workflow process, what organization it got scanned into, the supplier information, invoice number information, invoice amount. So any of the information that we're capturing on this invoice can be returned. We can look at the invoice directly from this interface just by clicking on this icon. And then we can look at any of the other history information, so we keep an audit trail of where it's been. We can look at any of the other metadata or properties values that have been assigned to that, and if there's been any sticky notes assigned or any annotations, we can look at that information as well. So in addition to access through the browser interface, we've also got access through the ERP system. So anybody who needs to see this, who should be able to see this information, can have access through multiple touch points. So one last thing that I want to show, if we come in here, we can look at the business activity monitoring. So I'm going to log in as our WebLogic user, and we can look at information that's in the workflow, be able to set up dashboards for ourselves. So with the Active Studio, I can create my own dashboard. If I just want to see reports on information that's in the workflow, I can come in here, select the type of report that I want to see. So I'm going to select the imaging dashboard. And you can see I've got different types of information being presented here. I've got a list of invoices that are in the process. I've got a chart that shows me the invoices that have come through by month. I can see them by the status, whether they're in exception queues, whether they've been approved, whether it's invalid PO. And then I can drill down into any of that information just by clicking on that region in the graph. Any alerts, you can see total dollar amounts. We can take dollar amount information into account. And then we can see invoice queues by task. So again, we can drill down into any of these bar graphs if we need to. And then if we need to go back to the graph, we can just use the navigation. But it's very easy to set up these different types of widgets on this dashboard, make it easy to access the type of information that you need to see for what's in the process, be able to get things like accrual reports that show me what's in the process but hasn't been entered into my EBS system. You can filter this by any of these values. You can have things like top 10 lists in here. So there's really a wide variety of information that you can get out of this dashboard. So overall, we've walked through and seen all the information for capturing the document, for extracting the information automatically, and seeing how we can verify that information. We stored it in our content repository, and we've seen access to that repository from just a standard browser interface, but also from the ERP system. We've seen some of the exceptions where the invoice will get rerouted based on errors that it saw, either from the extraction of the information or from the validation of the information against what's in our e-business suite system. And then we saw the underlying monitoring of the information that's in the workflow. So we've started taking this from end to end, seeing how all the components are integrated, see how the information flows back and forth, and seeing how this has been a standard Oracle created, integrated, and supported solution. Thank you.